I thought we'd just start by showing a piece of footage. It's about 2 minutes long and is kind of central to the story that we're going to be talking about tonight. It is some footage of the commando raid, the Russian commando raid on the Greenpeace ship Arctic Sunrise. This piece of footage was held on a small thumbnail card, which the guy who shot it, Phil Ball, then slipped into the sole of his shoe and smuggled into jail. And he had a 9-week saga trying to smuggle it out of jail to us because it was critical for a legal case that we were bringing. We can talk about that a little bit more later, but it's a piece of footage that perhaps gives context to this story.
Describe what action these people on this ship called the Arctic Sunrise were trying to pull off, and then who exactly was spiraling down from that helicopter.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the film that you just watched was shot on, I think it was 19th of September 2013. The day before that, 30 Greenpeace activists on the ship, the Arctic Sunrise, sailed towards the Priazlomnia oil rig, about 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It was a rig that was operated by Gazprom, the Russian state-owned energy company, effectively Putin's own oil company. The intention was to conduct a classic piece of non-violent direct action. They were going to hang a 1-ton survival pod off the side of the rig. You could have lived in there for days, possibly weeks. It had state-of-the-art communication systems on board, so they could have tweeted and Skyped, etc., etc. And the aim was to focus attention on this rig, the Priazlomnia, which was the first rig, it was intending to be the first rig to pump oil from the icy waters of the Arctic and therefore spark this Arctic oil rush that we're seeing manifested in Seattle at the moment with the Polar Pioneer. About 4 in the morning, our guys went in on speedboats. They approached the rig. It's about the size of a football stadium, 600 feet by 600 feet, a massive monolith, possibly even bigger than the one that you've got down in the harbour at the moment. Very soon it was evident that the Russians were not going to react in the way that perhaps the British or American or the Danish Coast Guard would in Greenland, where Greenpeace had previously done this. Guns were pulled very quickly, shots were fired, a cannon was fired from the Coast Guard ship over the bow of the Arctic Sunrise, and our guys retreated fearful for their lives very quickly. The next day, at about 7 in the evening, my friend Frank Hewitson, who features in that video getting duffed up at the end, is out on the heli deck looking at what he described as a beautiful sunset when he saw a small black dot coming off the the Coast Guard ship. He thought it was a wasp. He heard a hum. He thought, it can't be a wasp. You're not going to have a wasp 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. He then thought it might be a media helicopter, and he thought CNN aren't going to be 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It came over the Arctic sunrise, as we saw there, and commandos began rappelling out of there, cradling rifles, and using quite brutal force, they took over the ship, and they seized it, and this scene here is them towing it to Murmansk. It was about a 5-day journey to Murmansk. The guys at that time thought that they would probably get taken to Murmansk and get a slap on the wrist and just get sent home. That's the normal modus operandi, to be honest, of a Greenpeace protest. The only thing of note that really happened on the journey was that these commandos, who were 19, 20 years old, had continued to wear their balaclavas 24 hours a day, but raided the ship's booze cabinet. And so any self-respecting sailing crew would obviously have a large stack of Sailor Jerry rum. The Russians got hold of that, downed it quickly, and all that our friends could see through the balaclavas were red bloodshot eyes, and the soldiers were kind of unsteadily going down the corridor with their guns kind of bouncing off the walls, etc. Apart from that, it was pretty uneventful. They got to Murmansk, they thought they'd get sent home, they were taken to court, and this is where things took a decided turn for the worse, because they were informed in court that they were being charged with piracy. It was a crime that carried a minimum sentence of 10 years and a maximum sentence of 15 years. And crucially, in a country where 99% of all people who are charged end up being found guilty. This was a profound shock to them. They were taken to Murmansk CISO 1 isolation jail, a former mental asylum, that evening, and put into cells, the men, with other Russian prisoners. Because piracy carries a sentence of 15 years, they were held with people who were facing similar sentences. In this case, they were therefore people who were charged with murder and manslaughter. The women were kept in solitary confinement, and the saga began. They were there for several months in the end. We thought it would be 15 years. I was part of the campaign that mobilized to get them out. It was an incredibly frightening experience for us, but for the guys actually inside, it was truly, truly traumatic. Eventually, just before Christmas 2013, they were released, and Putin gave them an amnesty on the same day that he gave Pussy Riot an amnesty, and they were freed. When they got out, they told me incredible stories of what it was like to be in jail, and I wrote those stories down on napkins and bits of paper and stuffed them away, and thought, I want to write a book about this, and eventually I did, and that's what this book is about. The title, Don't Trust, Don't Fear, Don't Beg, is a Russian prison motto. In Russian, it is Never ne boysa ne prosi. It's what the prisoners were told, the Arctic 30 were told, this is the way to survive. Don't trust, don't fear, don't beg. Don't trust the prison system and the prison officers. To trust them is to disrespect yourself. Don't fear, because your fear gets you nowhere. It eats you up from the inside. And don't beg, because no one ever begged their way out of an isolation jail. And using this motto and other psychological techniques, they managed to survive until they got out. And that was the story in 5 minutes.
And this is an interesting story from an interesting perspective, because unlike most journalists, Ben was running media on the inside. So you got all these amazing details from the activists who weren't afraid to talk to you and weren't media trained necessarily. Yeah. But one detail from the raid that I really liked is there's this moment in the book in the very beginning where one of the crew members, I think, is taking footage on an iPhone 4. Yeah. And one of the commandos, the 19, 20-year-old guys that were rappelled down in these really scary balaclavas, she can tell that he's smiling at her. And she's squinting at him through the little slit in the balaclava, and he goes, "Is that an iPhone 4 or an iPhone 5?" And she goes, "It's an iPhone 4," and he goes, "I have an iPhone 5." So I think that also sets up how bizarre the proceedings in Russia got from there. Yeah. But before we get into that very surreal experience, I want to go back to where you were when this was happening. You were in a place called the Room of Doom at the time. Where were you when this was happening? What were you feeling? Tell me about that.
Well, for us, it was a standard Greenpeace protest, to be honest. And even when the commandos came down, I have to be honest, my first thought was, they're going to get some incredible footage of that, and we're going to have to get it out, and that's going to be really, really useful for our campaign. When that was happening, therefore, we still thought that we were winning, and this was going to be fantastic for our campaign. It got pretty frightening, actually, for me, when I was sitting in a pub in London, and Frank Hewitson phoned me when they just got near Murmansk, and therefore he could get a signal on his own iPhone.
Frank is the captain, right?
Not the captain, he was the lead activist, so he was the one that organized the protest. And I was sitting in a pub, and my phone rang, and it was one of those things with like 16 digits because it was coming from abroad. And Frank very, very quickly said, "I've got a couple of minutes to explain this before we're getting seized and taken onto the mainland." It was 20 commandos. They're heavily armed. They were very, very drunk. And one guy has just come on with epaulets and a huge like dinner plate hat. He says, "We're going to court and we're going to jail for 15 years." And then the line went dead. So suddenly for us, this went out of the realm of harvesting great footage and getting a good media story to shine a light on Arctic drilling, and into, quite frankly, what for us was a humanitarian crisis. Our friends were facing 15 years in jail. We very quickly mobilized a team. We positioned ourselves in a bunker in the London office. We worked straight away, 16 hours a day. Very soon, we could smell an appalling smell radiating from the walls. We wondered what it was. We realized very soon it was us, and we probably needed to go home and shower. We were just existing off junk food and high fructose nonsense. And that's why someone named it the Room of Doom, because we were scared. We were very, very scared, and we felt that, we were playing this game of geopolitical chess, where on the one side there were us, these kind of amateur environmentalists that didn't really know how this game worked, and on the other side, Putin's diplomats, some of the hardest men, in the world of diplomacy, and we had to somehow outsmart them to get our friends out, and that's how the beginning of this campaign. Very quickly, I should say, we got some very good political advice right from the start. Do not blame Putin, they said. Do not back him into a corner. That's what the Pussy Riot team did. They said this is Putin's fault, and Putin, therefore, apparently felt that he couldn't back down. His pride was at stake. So we were told, quote, "Give Putin a wide turning circle." So instead, we made our campaign about Gazprom, the energy company, as a proxy for Putin, and went after Gazprom. So the book explains how we are pushing on the outside while our friends are going into this insane world of a Russian former mental asylum up in Murmansk.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel responsible?
Yeah, really. All of us that worked on that campaign suddenly thought, what the hell were we thinking? That was so naive, that you can go up and jump on a Russian oil platform and not expect to get raided by commandos. But it's very easy in retrospect to think that, because the previous year, in September 2012, we'd done a similar thing at the same oil rig, and the Coast Guard had done nothing. And so we were lulled, I think, into a false sense of security. But all of us had feelings of guilt and still do.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to point out that all these actions, this campaign against Arctic drilling, is ongoing. There were actually 6 Greenpeace activists over the summer who boarded the Polar Pioneer, which is now sitting right next to Elliott Bay. They rappelled and climbed their way on. They stayed on it for 6 days, I believe, until it became too dangerous. They were facing swells and some really harsh seas. And
that was the kind of protest that we were trying to do in September 2013 on the Priaz-Lomne oil rig. And the reaction of the Russians, I think we were told by our sources in the Kremlin, was a result of Putin, a combination of two things. Firstly, being outraged that anybody would challenge Russian power in that way. But secondly, he genuinely believed that we were representatives of the CIA. There was an extraordinary film that appeared on NTV, which is a Russian TV channel actually owned by Gazprom. That's the state of the media there. You think it's bad in America, check out Russia. But you know, this documentary, within a few days of this episode, alleged that Greenpeace were funded by the CIA, funded by BP, never criticized Exxon, and didn't say anything about the Deepwater Horizon disaster because we're funded by BP. And then a fifth very odd allegation, that we had a history of abusing kangaroos. And this appeared on Russian television, and we were on the back foot straight away in Russia. You know, we were tagged as enemies of Putin. And our guys in jail were watching this on television. It was being translated by their cellmates, and it was very evident to them that we were in big, big trouble. I remember the lead lawyer, Jasper Toolings, took me aside and said, "This is not about the law. This is about politics. This is cowboy law, and we are in deep, deep shit."
That's terrifying, first of all. Second of all, I want to get into the prison because I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of the book. Can you tell us how they communicated? They communicated by something called doroga. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Doroga means the road. When they first arrived in jail, the guys, as I said, were put in with other Russian male prisoners, and very quickly they saw a sock flipping in and out between the bars of the prison windows, and this was explained to them. This was the doroga. This was the communication system that the prisoners used to be able to share contraband and messages. And the way it worked was this: the bread in the morning was bought in plastic bags. They would take the plastic bag and push it through a paracetamol tube and take a pencil at the end and using it as a spinny. They would draw out the bags to create these very, very thick, strong orange ropes. Then they would take a newspaper, they would roll it on the ground until it was very, very tight, and take a plastic bag and melt it with a match around it so it became a very, very strong, long baton. They'd hammer a nail into the end, take a bag with a bar of soap on, attach it to the rope, stick it out of the window, and using this, they'd flick the ropes up, down, left, and right. And the other prisoners would stick their own batons out and catch them. And they shout the word "doma, doma," which means home, home, when it landed. Now, by doing this, they were able to construct a lattice, a network of ropes around the walls on the outside of the prison, a kind of a physical prison internet. And this shows how important human contact is for people who have been locked up. They then took a sock, which in Russian they called the kon, which means the stallion, and through that they would put little messages. You know, you'd write it on a bit of paper the size of a cigarette packet. You put cell 423, Dima, "Oh my God, man, what are we doing here?" And it was an email, and it whipped off to that cell, and 10 minutes later they got a reply, or they would get cigarettes that they were able to trade.
Better than Comcast, by the way.
Yeah, right. And you know, so I wasn't able to put this in the book because the person that told me this didn't want his cellmate to get in trouble. But you know, guns and mobile phones were traded on the doroga, and then that evening all of them got a circular called a malavaya, a message from the mafia bosses who control the place. The mafia bosses are called the Kotlovaya, and this same message, actually I'm going to read it out. This same message went to everybody, all of the guys who were on the doroga, and the mafia bosses sent them this message. It's in a weird language that was both kind of rough and formal, very ornate, and it goes back 150 years, the tradition of the doroga. And the message said, "The best of day and time to you, all arrestees. Here is hoping this note finds you in good health and strong of mood. Here is the deal. There is us and there is them. There are thieves and there are stars. The stars have stars on their shoulder plates, and these, dear friends, are the guards. Now, then, there is us. We are the arrestees. We are the thieves. Now, the doroga is most important. It keeps us as one, together in solidarity. It is what keeps us alive. If there is anything you need, you will have it. All you need do is ask. You will not sell or buy things. No, you are expected to give. If you have something to give, then give it. If you need something, it will be given to you. If you want to be part of the doroga, you are welcome to join our community of ropes. You will be supported. You will be given what you need. If, however, you are afraid to be a part of the road, we understand, and you will still be given support. but do not interfere with the daroga. If you interfere with the road, then you will be punished. You will no longer be a part of us, you will be one of them. You will no longer be a thief, you become a star. And this went to all of them. Now bear in mind, these are just a bunch of activists who went out to do something and now they are, their first night in a Russian prison, they're getting that message. They were then told that there is a hierarchy of cells. At the top were the people's cells, which is the cells that they were in for prisoners who hadn't done anything wrong. Then the mafia dictated who were in the other cells. In the cell beneath that, they were called woolen cells, and informers went in there. If you informed on a drug dealer, you were put in there as punishment by the mafia. Beneath that were cells for passive homosexuals. It's an odd phrase, and read the book and I can explain what passive homosexuals are. It's a weird world where actually there was less homophobia in jail in Russia than outside. And at the very bottom were cells for former officers of law enforcement who were now in jail. They had to be kept in different cells because otherwise they would have been killed by the other prisoners. And that's the world they found themselves in when they woke up on a Friday morning, their first morning in CISO 1, facing 15 years in jail.
Yeah, so something that I've been thinking about too is, you have 30 people in this Russian prison. It actually provokes quite a bit of international response. Paul McCartney writes to Vladimir Putin because Putin happens to be a Beatles fan, to see if that can sway him.
It did, I'm told. I mean, weirdly, our Russian colleague said the only person that can get more media in Moscow than Putin is McCartney. And so we wrote to McCartney, and of course you expect something coming back saying, no, we will not forward this to Mr. McCartney. I got an email back. I'm a massive Beatles fan. I got an email back saying, sure, what do you want me to say? And he wrote this line at the end of the letter, said, was a line from back in the USSR. He said, dear Vladimir, one of my favorite Beatles songs is Back in the USSR. It's got the line in it, been away so long I hardly knew the place. Gee, it's good to be back home. Can you make that come true for the Arctic 30?
And the answer was niet. There wasn't an answer yet.
There wasn't an answer yet.
But I'm curious about how the regular Russian people, civil society, perceive this, because during the Pussy Riot trial, there was this conversation about how there wasn't a word for feminism in Russian. There wasn't really a word or a concept for activism. So, I mean, do you have any sense of how Russian civil society interpreted not only activism, but environmental activism and then direct action on top of that? At the same time, Putin was saying, this is an affront to the Russian Federation. This isn't just activists on an oil rig. This is very much tied up with our national identity and our national interests. Yeah,
and we should talk about the importance of the Arctic and fossil fuels for the Putin regime at some point. But yeah, I mean, about halfway through this, I called a guy called Martin Sixsmith, who he'd just written a book called Philomena that was turned into a movie that did very well at the Oscars that year. But before that, he was the BBC's Moscow correspondent and had written a fantastic book called Putin's Oil, about the role of oil in the Putin regime. Now, I got this out and read this in the first week of this saga because I wanted to understand how to win this geopolitical chess game that we were involved in. And Sixsmith said, yeah, I can give you half an hour of my time. So I went to meet him. And he said, you have to understand that out there in the sticks in Russia, Ivan and Masha are loving this. And what he meant by that is your average Russian out there is incredibly impressed by Putin standing up to the West and standing up to these environmentalists and representing the true Russian interest. And that was a real wake-up call for me. I had imagined still that Putin was, a dictator, the head of a totalitarian regime, and to a certain extent he is, but we have to understand that he has enormous popular support in Russia. And at the same time, something remarkable happened. You can petition the Home Affairs Minister in Russia to have a prisoner released. You can ask them to release someone, but if you do that, you have to supply your name, your telephone number, and your address. So by doing it, you're giving them all of your details. So people began to do that for the Arctic 30, but by doing that, they were saying, I am an opponent of the regime, I'm a dissident, and I don't like what you're doing. 30,000 Russians did that, which is a remarkable number, and that was very, very brave of them. That country is going in a frightening direction, and those details are still held by the Home Affairs Ministry, and those people knew that. So yes, Ivan and Masha in the sticks were loving this, but there is a great, beautiful, liberal Russia out there, and I think it's bigger than we think it is.
There's also a really interesting parallel to what the United States is doing today. We're pursuing an all-of-the-above energy policy, which means, yeah, we care about climate change, it's real, but we're going to go to the Arctic and drill and look for these unconventional oil and gas resources anyway that won't even come online for at least another 10 years out. And then 10 years from now, we're still going to be relying on oil and gas, so we'll use them. But I mean, there is an intellectually honest argument in that. And it says, if the Arctic is melting, thank you, climate change, there are all these billions of barrels of oil under there, and someone's going to get it, right? It's going to be Russia, or it's going to be Norway, or someone else. If this is inevitable, why we should have, the United States regulating activity up there. We should have a democratic element in that kind of fight, that squall for Arctic oil and gas resources. What do you make of that argument?
I don't buy it. I think we need to draw a line in the ice and let none of the nations exploit the oil and gas in the Arctic. There is a profound irony here. The ice is rapidly melting because of rising temperatures. Instead of seeing that as a profound warning to humanity, the oil companies and many governments see that as an opportunity to get at the oil that was previously below the ice. When they get there, they'll burn it. It will cause temperatures to rise and more ice to melt, which means they'll be able to get more oil. We're in a vicious circle, and we have to call a halt to it. At the same time, as the ice melts, the Arctic reflects less of the sun's radiation back out into space. When the white ice is replaced by dark water, we absorb that heat instead, causing temperatures to go up even more, causing the ice to melt, causing temperatures to go up even more. It's a feedback loop. These are both vicious circles. And I think the job of activists is to go up there and say the unpopular things, which is there's a lot of money there, there's a lot of energy there, but we're going to burn the planet if we get it. Scientists tell us we have to leave a great deal of the oil in the ground, and let's start with the Arctic oil. You can't clean up an Arctic oil spill. So that should be a sanctuary where we shouldn't go. If an American said to me, well, an American did just said to me, or presented the argument, well, if Russia's going to go up there, why don't we? Well, two things. Firstly, Russia's finding it difficult. The sanctions that have been instigated since the Ukraine crisis make it difficult for Russia to exploit the oil and gas up there. They need Western companies to join them. And secondly, I guess there's a kind of more philosophical argument. One has to be careful about comparing fossil fuel extraction to the great crimes of the past. I think we're all implicated in the fossil fuel economy. I flew here. That plane did not run on soya milk and flower petals. So we have to be careful what we say. However, people said in the time of slavery, well, why should we give up? Everybody else is operating this same economic system. And at some point, you just have to stand up and do the right thing.
So this was taken in 2013. Shell was actually in Seattle before that. It was here in 2012, before its first shot at Arctic exploration, and it was here with the Kuluk. The Kuluk is an oil rig that eventually had to be scrapped because it ran aground on its way back to Seattle. It was being towed back to avoid excess taxes in Alaska, it turns out. But at the same time, in 2012, you didn't have people in kayaks going into Elliott Bay. You didn't have the local tribes joining them. There wasn't that same energy, and Greenpeace has been on Shell, on Gazprom for so many years, but these grassroots actions have been really fascinating to me. I've been covering them. What do you think has changed between 2012, 2013, and today so that we have this kind of grassroots response?
I think Keystone XL created an environment in the US where suddenly activism was exciting again to the media. I think Bill McKibben did a really, really fantastic job of that. But I actually think the Arctic 30 has played a part. I was asked this the other night, and I can't provide you with a scientific equation or a map or something like that, but I think direct action can speed up the national and international conversation. It can create controversy where it previously didn't exist. And I think the theater of dissent, which is best manifested in direct action can suddenly wake people up. And I think that that's what happened with the Arctic 30. Suddenly the Arctic issue was on the international agenda. I found when I was phoning journalists up, I didn't need to explain the story anymore. And that's because those guys went to jail. It was a huge story. And by doing that, they really controversialized new oil and gas in the Arctic. And I think, you know, the US movement is so fantastic, and it's come in like in the wake of that, and it's exploiting this renewed interest in the Arctic. And you know, I was in France a couple of weeks ago when the kayak activists did their thing, and it was on. I saw it was on the front page of European newspapers. You know, this does not normally happen, and I think it's inspiring people around the world and capturing the attention of people around the world.
Which leads me to a follow-up question. Mm-hmm. How do you think kayak activists would have fared in Murmansk prison?
Well, you know what? What I learned in writing this book is you can't actually predict who would have done well and who wouldn't have done well in that jail cell. There were some really grizzled male activists dripping with testosterone that went in there that really, really struggled. And there was, for example, one woman, 21-year-old Camila Spezial from Argentina. She'd only left Argentina twice before, once for a weekend in New York and once for a week in Uruguay. You know, lots of 21-year-old women go on their gap year to pick fruit in Provence or something. She found herself in Murmansk Caesar 1 isolation jail, and she was really strong in there. And the others really relied on that strength. And I thought about it afterwards, why was that? And actually the people that really struggled were the ones with long-term partners and kids back home. And I think they felt quite guilty about being in there. And they really, really struggled to cope because they weren't just dealing with their own trauma. They knew that people were suffering back home, whereas some of the younger people and the women, actually, some of the younger women, really were rocks in there. So in answer to your question, how would they have done? I don't think there's a kind of a particular nationality trait that allows you to cope with this. There were 6 Brits in there. Some of them were fine. Some of them suffered profound psychological trauma. The one American in there, Pete Wilcox, a 61-year-old captain, a huge history of activism. He had a tough time in there, but he had got married 7 months beforehand, and his parents were 93 years old, and he didn't think he'd see them again. These are the things that cause people to do well or to really, really struggle in there, really. I think it's who's back home.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to also mention the charges at this point, what exactly these activists were charged with. So they got piracy, which legally made no sense, but on some kind of emotional level it makes sense. But then they also got charged with hooliganism eventually, right? Can you explain what that was? Yeah,
they got charged with hooliganism, which is the catch-all charge for dissidents in Russia. And in fact, Pussy Riot went down for hooliganism for 5 years. It carries a maximum sentence of 7 years. When the piracy charge was replaced with hooliganism, we didn't celebrate. We originally did, but realized very quickly that this was very bad news for the reason that Sydney just articulated. They would never have got piracy past the court of global public opinion. It was farcical that we were pirates. But hooliganism was a different matter. And it looked like they were pressing ahead with that. So, okay, it wasn't going to be 15 years, it was going to be 7 years, but they were serious, and they were taking them down for hooliganism. So at that point, we actually had to ramp up the campaign. At this point, the Olympics were about 4 months away in Sochi. And we were told by our advisors, do not talk about the Olympics. They're Putin's baby. If you do that, then you will back Putin into a corner. So instead, we wrote a strategy about how we would hijack the Olympics. And normally, we emailed each other with encrypted emails because we knew that the Russians were trying to read our emails. But we emailed that around deliberately unencrypted, knowing the Russians would read it as a little wink at them about what we could do at Sochi. And this was because of the hooliganism charge. We thought we'd have to ramp it up at that point because we thought they were going down for a long time.
Mm-hmm. But eventually they had this amnesty option on the table, and the activists started to be freed one by one. At the end, though, there was this one activist, his name was Denis Sinyakov, and he wanted to stay. He didn't want amnesty. He wanted to go through the entire Russian trial. And at the end, you say in your book that he felt kind of betrayed by Greenpeace. And so I'm wondering, did he resolve those feelings, or what is he doing now?
Well, I mean, what happened was Putin offered amnesty Dennis didn't want to take it because he thought that it was accepting Putin's justice. He wanted to go to court and prove that he was not a hooligan. I'll be honest, we put a lot of pressure on him to accept that amnesty because we were told that, that if anyone refused the amnesty, then the whole of the amnesty offer would be withdrawn. So it was a really dramatic saga asking Dennis to take one for the team. He did that, and then he came to the firm conclusion that it wouldn't have had any impact on anybody else, and that's why he felt betrayed. I asked him 4 months later whether he still felt the same way. By that time, Russia had invaded Crimea, and there was a state of war existed, and he said, "Thank God I took that amnesty." Yeah.
So I also kind of want to move a parallel to today, because clearly Greenpeace in 2013 had gotten under Putin's skin. This was personal. The Kremlin was involved because of the way those commandos came down. Immediately, it was different than other actions. Today, I think activists are asking themselves, what will get under Shell's skin? This is a multinational corporation that's invested billions and billions of dollars in the Arctic. They are responsive to their shareholders, right? What about activism? What about kayaks changes that equation? I mean, there was an article that came out in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, written by this guy, Mackenzie Funk. He's a local journalist. He's incredible. If you have the time, you should read his article called "The Wreck of the Kuluk." And he called it Shell's cold calculations for a warming world. So if these are cold, hyper-rational capitalist decisions, I mean, how does any kind of direct action change that?
I think it does. And you know, during the Arctic 30 saga, we had a guy that went to meet investors in oil companies and shareholders in BP and Shell, and they were very, very concerned about the reputational damage to oil companies by that saga. If you look at what's happening with Shell at the moment by going up there, I don't think they are at all confident and certain about what they're doing there. Ben Van Buren, the chief executive, has already said that he had a kind of long, dark night of the soul when he took over, trying to judge whether they should go back to the Arctic. They've put $5 billion in, and they haven't really got a return yet. And so we're really working at the margins here. You know, I think if we can shift the cost-benefit ledger just by a few percentage, then we can persuade them to pull out. They are not gung-ho, fully in there, confident. They are definitely going to be responsive to public pressure. We did a big protest against Shell Arctic oil drilling in London a couple of years back, where we climbed Europe's tallest skyscraper, 6 women. They got on top of it and demanded that Shell pull out because the skyscraper was next to their headquarters. We got intelligence after that they had discussions at board meeting level about the reputational damage that they were suffering and whether they should be going back in as a result of protests like that. I think the kayak activists got, you know, as much media attention as that skyscraper thing, and there will be more to come. And I think Shell are probably going to try to stay up there for a year or two, but as things stand, if they pump another their $6 billion, their $7th billion in, and they're still not getting a return, then they're really going to look at the reputational damage they're suffering, and that's going to be a really big factor. I mean, it happens.
You and I were also kind of talking about something before we came on stage, and that's the different types of activism in the climate movement. You know, Greenpeace is an international organization. It's very well organized, it's hierarchical. What we've seen with the kayaktivists on the ground in Seattle is that it's got this horizontal kind of consensus-based structure, kind of like what you saw with Occupy Wall Street. And they're really trying to make the voices who are front and center some of the people who might be the most affected by climate change. They are people of color, they are low income, they're, you know, workers. How do you see Greenpeace's efforts working with some of those grassroots values going forward? Because you kind of mentioned that they don't always go together so easily.
I think it's a different way of working, but I think we generally have the same values. I think the great thing that's happening here in Seattle at the moment is that a movement has grown up encompassing all of those different groups, and that's really where the power comes from. I was involved in a big campaign in London to stop a Heathrow third runway, the third runway at Heathrow that was destroying villages and would have been pretty bad for climate change. And Greenpeace approached the local activist groups there warily because people have a suspicion of the big brand coming in. But by developing trust with those groups, you can have a very, very powerful movement that brings the best of Greenpeace, which is organization, I guess experience, money, to be honest, but then the passion of local groups who really, really know how to organize on the ground and get people out there in numbers. I think that's what's happening here.
Great. Well, we could talk about activism and strategy for a very long time. I did want to ask you about the potatoes, though, if you could just share what happened. This one activist had a problem with potatoes in the prison, and
So yeah, Sini Surela went into jail. She's from Finland. She announced on the first evening that she was a vegan. This led to a very perplexed reaction amongst the Russian prison authorities. Vegan? What is vegan? And when she explained what it was, they were very confused. She was served meat and fish head soup every night. She therefore got a message to us. We found a way to smuggle messages in and out. And she said, I need to get vegan food. So we put a lot of pressure on the prison governor, who was a psychotic guy called Popov. And eventually, Sini woke up in the morning, she was bought breakfast, and it was 3 giant, hard, cold boiled potatoes, each one the size of a baseball. For lunch, she was bought 3 cold, hard boiled potatoes, and then when it came to the evening, she had dinner, and that consisted of 3 cold, hard boiled potatoes. She managed to eat a few of them, but the others she threw away because they were just too big and too disgusting. Popov, the governor, walked into her cell, saw that she'd thrown potatoes away, and lost his mind. He screamed at her. She vividly told me about how his moustache was dancing on his upper lip as spittle from his lips was landing in her face as he was threatening to send her to the punishment cell for throwing away the potatoes. Then he stomped out. And the next morning, she got breakfast, and it was 3 hard, giant boiled potatoes, and the same for lunch and dinner. So she began hiding them in her cell. She tied them in bags and hid them under the bed and behind the sink, but they began to smell. So she tried to flush them down the toilet, but she blocked the toilet and thought, I'm definitely going to the punishment cell now. She left them on the windowsill, and there was a tiny gap in the window where pigeons would poke their beaks. She hoped that the pigeons would eat them, but the pigeons of Murmansk were not interested in her potatoes. She was increasingly worried she was going to go to the punishment cell. So eventually, this insane situation came about where she went to meet her lawyer, a woman called Larissa, who is a real hero in this saga. And they're sitting down on opposite sides of the table in the meeting room of the prison, a guard standing by them. Sini draws an object out of her pocket, holds it under the table, and says, Larissa, take this from my hand. Larissa puts her hand under the table, feels for what's in Sini's hand, and says, Sini, it's a potato. You're asking me to smuggle potatoes out of the jail? And she said, I can't, because I'll lose my license. And Sini broke down and was terrified, absolutely terrified. Eventually, she found a way to smuggle the potatoes out of jail and avoid the punishment cell, but I will leave you to read the book to find out how she did it.
One last question, then I think we can open up to Q&A. How much oversight did Greenpeace, the organization, as opposed to you, representative of that organization, have over the book? Did they look at any pre-published text? How controlled was that?
I wrote it on my own time, and I only showed it to the lawyer, and I said, is this going to get anybody into any trouble? And he said, that section will, and that section will. So I changed it, because I didn't want anyone to have negative legal repercussions. And apart from that, I wanted to keep it independent of Greenpeace. And so, for example, I explore in it some of the criticisms that Greenpeace got, how some of the activists were and still are very angry at Greenpeace and felt the organization was naive to send them up there. I didn't want to make it a hagiography for Greenpeace at all, because I don't think it would have any credibility.
Yeah. With that, questions?
You mentioned lawyers several times.
Yeah.
Do you all meet with a lawyer and ask them what's up, and is it possible that we'll be charged with hooliganism?
I mean, that was really the nub of the controversy between the activists. There is always a legal briefing that you get saying, this is what we're planning, this is what you could be charged with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The legal briefing in this case said piracy is a possibility, but it's extremely unlikely. As it happened. And some of the activists felt that that was a dereliction of duty, and the fact that they were charged with piracy is an indication that it was a very real prospect. But yeah, before you go into something like this, you are given a list, and it's usually quite scary because they always give you the maximum jail sentence. I've been on actions where they'll say, you do this, it could be 10 years inside, but you know that's not going to happen. But yeah, you're given a legal briefing, but in this case, it was the most controversial legal briefing, I think, in Greenpeace history. People still argue about what that meant and whether Greenpeace was naive by going up there.
Did anything change as a result after that? Because I think just being on the ground and covering some of these protests, it seems like Greenpeace is kind of taking a step back and letting the kayak activists do their thing.
I think that would have happened anyway, but in terms of Greenpeace actions, we learned a lot. And there was a big debrief document, an inch thick. What can we learn from this? And that stuff's being enacted.
Thanks for the book. I read it in one day. You cannot put it down. It's fabulous, and thank you so much for writing it. Can you review for us international waters? Your understanding was you were going into international waters. This was illegal action. They insisted was that they had jurisdiction 3 miles around their rig. Was it 3 miles?
Yeah.
And that you were entering their territory.
Yeah.
And then it was given to the International Waters Commission. What was it called?
The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea.
And does that have real weight? I did not know about that. And can you talk about that tribunal and what is the real law of the seas these days?
So, okay, so there is an exclusion zone of 3 miles around the rig. We went in there and they would have had a right to throw us out of that. But because it was 200 miles off the coast, it was in international waters. There are only 2 reasons that you can raid a ship and arrest people in international waters. They are for illegal scientific research and piracy. And that's why they were charged with piracy, because it was a post facto way of justifying the raid on the ship. When that happened, we put a case into the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which is the governing body for issues around what happens at sea. And crucial to that was proving that we weren't pirates. And crucial to that was getting that piece of film, because there are only one set of pirates in that film, and those are the gun-toting guys with balaclavas. And that's why it was so important that Phil Ball got the footage out to us.
They did not admit they did come on the helicopter commandos, the whole...
They denied it, and then the guys were released about 3 days before the verdict in that case, where the international court said you have to release them. And we think, combined with Sochi, that the Russians and their spies knew that this verdict was coming. And you might say that they can just ignore an international court, but the fact is they are a maritime nation. They have to exist. If they want the protection from pirates and other countries acting in a rogue way, they have to act in accordance with the court. So the court verdict was important in the end, I think.
Yes.
May I make a comment?
Yes.
Okay. There are on the internet countless petitions regarding energy and dirty energy and climate change. And I'm in a number of groups that sign petitions. And a few of the petitions are starting to say, leave fossil fuels in the ground. And at the demonstration I went to for the Shell oil that was in the park, somebody had a wonderful sign saying, leave the oil in the soil, the coal in the hole, and the tar sands in the land. And on the internet, the petitions generally have a place where you can make a comment besides signing the petitions. And last night I started what is my project, and about 50 petitions, all on fracking as it happened, and some of them on oil. I wrote, leave the oil in the soil, the coal in the hole, and the tar sands in the land, plus the comment that 82% of fossil fuel reserves need to be left in the ground if we are to avoid climate catastrophe. And I think that comes from the 350 group, that particular statistic of 82%. Anyway, it sounds good. And so, and that's my project, is to just track down all the petitions I can and put that comment to raise consciousness, to leave the fossil fuels, not this fracking is bad and that fracking is bad and this coal mine shouldn't happen and this oil train shouldn't happen and this pipeline shouldn't happen, but leave it in the ground, leave it all in the ground. As fast as possible, convert, do whatever it has to. And also, on some of the comments I put, the United States, when we entered World War II, we made this massive transition from a peace economy to a war economy. I mean, instead of producing cars, we were producing tanks and, you know, arms instead of refrigerators, and getting all these people up from the South to work in the war industries, getting all the women out of the house to work in the war industries, you know, a massive effort, not to mention the effort to make the atomic bomb, which is another huge effort. In other words, we are capable, if we have national will, and if we have the national consciousness that we want this, to make a massive transition, you know, within weeks, months, if we have to, from one kind of economy to another kind of economy. But we have to get Shell and all those guys out of the way first.
I think that's a really good point, and I'm actually glad you brought it up, because that's, I think, another thing that's changed between 2013 and today. There's this new keep it in the ground argument, and it's based on this idea that we have more fossil fuel reserves in the ground that we can burn responsibly. And there was actually a paper that came out in Nature earlier this year that pointed to Arctic oil and gas specifically and said, in any kind of future scenario where we're burning this, it's incongruent with keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, which international leaders have long agreed is dangerous. But I think this also directly goes back to your story, and which revolves around this idea that it's in Russia's national interest to go drill for oil in the Arctic, and it's personal to Putin, because I think it's also central to our national identity in a way, or it's become so ingrained over the years that we need to produce oil domestically. We need to do that for our own national interests. And I mean, how do we this is not an easy question to answer. How do we get away from that?
I don't know. I mean, we haven't got much time left, but I just on that, you know, Russia, or Arctic oil is so central to Putin's strategy to stay in power. They have described it as a national project akin to their own moon landing project. In 2007, Putin sent an explorer up to the Arctic in a submarine. They went under the North Pole and planted a titanium Russian flag on the seabed beneath the North Pole and said, "This is ours." You know, that's what we're up against. In the States, I think it's going to be easier because at least there are vaguely democratic levers that you can pull, but you're squinting. But that's maybe, I defer to someone who lives in America about that. I think you live in a democracy, don't you?
Sometimes.
Okay, that's for the next town hall discussion, possibly.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious how much press and attention the divestment movement has gotten in England, and whether or not any news about the recent UW divestment got any media attention.
Yeah, it's taken off in the last 3 months or so. 350 are doing a great job in the UK, but as well as that, the Guardian newspaper took it on as their huge campaign. The editor, Alan Rushbridger, who did the Snowden story and WikiLeaks, etc., said, "I've got 3 months left of my editorship. I'm going to make it all about climate change." The campaign's called Keep It in the Ground. Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben were the advisors for that campaign, and divestment just exploded as an issue, such that universities now are all being asked the question. The ones that do it are getting a lot of credibility. The ones that don't are finding students mobilizing on the campus. It's one of the quickest developing climate campaigns I've ever seen, and it's terribly, terribly exciting. One reason why is because there's a target in every town, you know, and students have so much energy, and it's giving people purchase on the climate issue that they didn't previously have. So all hail Bill McKibben and 350. You know, it's gone viral, it's spread to the UK, and it's defining climate campaign. Greenpeace is catching up, to be honest, on that.
Okay, last couple questions. Yes, sir.
What became of the vessel?
The vessel was held for another 4 months. The Arctic, some of the guys who sailed on the ship and live on the ship didn't feel they'd truly been liberated until the ship came home. They talked about the Arctic 31, When we got it back, it had been trashed by the Russians. You know, they had deposited the contents of their bowels, literally, you know, all over that ship. They had ripped it apart, and it cost us a lot of money to fix it. And in fact, some of the money from the book, all the money from the book I'm giving away. I got about $75,000 for it. I'm giving it to $350 to Russian human rights groups, to Greenpeace to fix the ship. And there'll be more money to come because David Putnam, who's a filmmaker who made some of my favorite films, Chariots of Fire, Killing Fields, Midnight Express, won the Oscar and the Palme d'Or, has bought the option. He's making the book into a movie. So there'll be more money.
I'm curious as to how you got that film. I mean, you know, how did that guy manage not to get shot?
Yeah.
And how could he be filming when those people were pointing guns?
Okay, so yeah, last quick story. Phil Ball, he was a tiny GoPro, the kind of thing that cyclists wear on their head. He filmed it with that. He took the memory card out. He had commandos coming at him from all angles, and he took the memory card and he stuck it into his underpants, and he trusted that they wouldn't go into his underpants to find it. He said that it was the one moment that he was very glad of what he called Russia's culture of homophobia. Maybe that's not fair, but anyway. He stuck it then into the sole of his shoe when they weren't watching, and it went into jail with him. We devised a method of getting messages in and out. In the book, I use a pseudonym for the person that helped us there. I called him Mr. Babinski, but that's not the real name of the person that helped us smuggle letters out. Phil smuggled a letter out to me, and it said, when Percy came to see Thomas the Tank Engine, I captured a photograph. Now, for those of you that don't know, Thomas the Tank Engine is a 1940s British series of children's books, and that was his code, because Percy was the helicopter in that. So we knew that he had this film. He then took a matchbox, he cut the bottom out of the matchbox and took that bit of card and put it in another matchbox, so it had a false bottom. He put his card, the memory stick, into it, and told us to get ready to exchange matchboxes at a place that I still can't say where it was because it would compromise someone who helped us, but he was going to be in a public place, and we swapped the matchboxes. In the book, I place it happening in a courtroom, but at the end of the book, I say, I want to be honest, it didn't happen in a courtroom, it happened somewhere else, but I can't tell you where it was, because then you would know who did the exchange, and then that person would go to jail. But that's how we got it out. We gave it to the International Court. That was instrumental in us winning the court case, and Phil that night saw it on his TV in Russia on Euronews and celebrated the fact that he got the card out, and it was a beautiful moment.
All right, round of applause I think is deserved. Thank you.
Cheers.